Hello everyone, in this lesson we're going to build on our knowledge of functions by talking about what are known as void functions. So until this point, every function we've looked at has returned a single value when we've called it. However, not every task in programming lends itself to a function that needs to return a value. If you just wanted to print instructions to the screen or display a summary statement with a program's output, there's really no meaning to returning a value in those scenarios, and there is a function that we can use for those kinds of subtasks. So a function that doesn't return a value is said to have a return type of void. And again, think of the everyday meaning of this word. Void just indicates the function returns nothing. And what's interesting is void functions can even be used for determining more than one value. You'll see in C++ there's a very powerful way to actually have a void function determine multiple values for you simultaneously. Again, that's going to be in our last topic we'll talk about. Today we'll just get into the basics of how to design void functions. Declaring a void function is a lot like declaring the other functions we've worked with. You just put the keyword void first. So some examples would be void sum function with an int x parameter, or even void display instructions with empty parentheses. That just indicates that function is not going to take any input parameters, and that's totally acceptable for both a void function and even functions that return values. If you think of the int main function, there's been an empty set of parentheses there your entire time in this class. Defining void functions is a lot like defining other functions. Main difference is a return statement is not required. And if you do happen to use a return statement, you're just simply going to use return semicolon instead of returning an expression. Since a void function does not return a value, there's no need to have an expression next to the return statement. And you'll see there's two definitions here for the two declarations we had in the previous slide. First one simply takes in that int x parameter and has a couple of cout statements where that x parameter is used within one of them, and there's no return statement. What happens is it'll execute this function line by line, and when it gets to that second cout statement, the function execution will be done with, and it'll go back to wherever called that function. Display instructions has the return statement, but as the comment says, that's totally optional. When you get to that last line of that function, regardless, the void function execution will be done with. Calling a void function is going to be a lot different than how we've called other functions. A call to a void function is its own program statement in C++. So examples of calling the two functions we've been talking about so far would be sum function parentheses 5. You'll notice that's its own statement. There's really nothing else happening in that line than just making a call to the sum function and then plugging in 5 as the argument. And simply the call display instructions would cause that display instructions function to execute. Again, take note of the empty parentheses. Since that is still a function call, you'll still have to use parentheses in some way. So main thing to be aware of is you cannot cout a call to a void function. Both of these would produce errors. So cout sum function 5 has no meaning. Sum function 5 is not going to return a value to us, so it can't be placed in a cout statement. And display instructions, that call does not return a value at all, so it can't be placed in a cout statement. Very common error when you're first beginning to code with void functions is to accidentally cout the result of a void function. It's its own program statement. And similarly, you can't place a void function call within another expression. So attempting to put sum function 5 within an expression where you're expecting a value is not going to work either. So these are, common examples of errors people might make coding with void functions. Whenever you make a call to a void function, it is always its own program statement. Some other details to be aware of. You can use both void functions and functions that return a value, whether they're int, double, bool, or char in the same program. That's totally fine. And although a return is optional, you can be thoughtful about how you use it within a void function to prevent certain code from running. Because once you hit that return statement, the function will be done executing and it'll go back to wherever called the function. And here's a nice example. Let's suppose you had a program that you tallied a sum and an amount of numbers and then just wanted to determine the average that you got from that calculation. So that would be done for this display average function that we have here. And you'll notice the if statement detects if the count variable is 0, there's a return below that, and it prevents the division by 0 that would happen within the cout statement. So if the value of count happens to be 0, we'll never actually reach that cout statement where we would end up dividing by 0. So you can be somewhat strategic about using a return within a void function. It's optional, but there are scenarios like this where it might be nice to use one. Another detail is it's totally acceptable to have a function, either void or otherwise, without parameters. Just be mindful that you still should use empty parentheses in the function declaration, definition, and call. That's how you indicate that this is actually a function. So if a function had no parameters, its declaration would look like this. Let's say void mystery with parentheses. Take note of the empty parentheses. Its definition, same idea. The heading line would have the empty parentheses. And where it's most likely forgotten for many people is in the actual function call. You have to make a call to mystery with those empty parentheses. So just be aware of that. It's definitely a common error, especially making a function call to a function that has an empty parameter list. You still have to use parentheses to indicate that you're making a function call. So now that you've seen the idea of a void function, I'd like you to pause and take a minute to decide which function to be most appropriate for each of these subtasks, whether it's a void function, a function that returns an int, a double, a bool, a char, or whatever else might be appropriate. So hopefully you took my advice and paused and thought through each of these scenarios. Let's go through what function to be most appropriate for each subtask we have here. So if you just want to display the instructions of a program to the screen, that's perfectly set up for a void function. There's no value being calculated or produced from that scenario. That function would just consist of a bunch of cout statements, most likely. If you wanted to find the gas mileage based on a trip length and an amount of gas used, that's definitely producing a return value. And I would say a function of type double would be most appropriate for that. You probably want some decimal precision there. A function that converts a number grade to a letter grade, probably a function that returns a char is most appropriate for that. Would take in the value of the grade as a number, probably use type double, and then return a char value to you. If you just wanted to summarize the results of some calculations in a program and you weren't actually giving a calculation value back, that's good for a void function. If you wanted to print the design to the screen again, keyword here is probably printing. Void would be good for that too, because there's no meaning to returning a specific value there. And if you're trying to determine if a number is positive, it's a scenario where you're going to get true or false. That'd be perfectly set up for a bool function, whose return type would either be a value that's true or false. So this is a decision you'll have to start making when you're designing programs. Is the subtask most appropriate for a void function or one that returns a value? We'll go through a demo of designing a program where we actually have both some void functions and a function that returns a value within the same program, so you get some experience using that.